Why have you got involved in the MyMP campaign?
For two reasons, really. One is because I believe very strongly in democracy, and I think democracy is about people having a say over what is done in their name by their governments and their representatives. And I think MyMP campaign, with its emphasis on giving voters much more direct control over what MPs do in their name and holding their MPs to account for that, is essentially deepening of our democracy. So I support it for that reason. And the second reason is that everyone knows that there is enormous frustration across the country with the way politics is done in Westminster. People feel very alienated and very annoyed by politicians' behaviour. And when I've spoken to many people about this myself. I've looked at the academic research that has been done on what's behind that alienation, and it's very clear that the primary reason is that people feel that politicians don't listen to them. They don't really act on their views, they act on the interests of party leaders or the media or party donors, and that's what's driving that frustration. So I think because the MyMP campaign says that voters, above anyone else, should be who MPs listen to when they make the big decisions in Parliament that they're called on to make, I think that is why the campaign will address that frustration and that alienation.
But surely some issues dealt with by MPs are just too complicated or technical for discussion by voters.
Yeah, MPs do get involved in really technical matters. The debates in the House of Commons, particularly in the committees of the House of Commons, can really get down to lots of detail around particular paragraphs or lines in laws. And I don't think anyone's saying that every voter needs to be engaged in every paragraph of every bill that goes before the House of Commons. But those debates themselves are set by bigger decisions about the general direction of policy and legislation for the lifetime of a parliament. And it's those bigger conversations about what a parliament is going to do, what legislation it's going to enact, that voters can be engaged in. MPs may then have to make quite detailed decisions, but even those detailed decisions should be in line with the bigger framework that's been set by deliberation and a conversation with voters in their constituencies.
And what about when there's a really urgent decision that needs to be made? Surely sometimes there's just not enough time.
Of course, absolutely. Sometimes Parliament is faced by some very pressing issues, and I think under those occasions, I think it's fair enough to say that MPs will have to be left to make a decision on behalf of the country if a decision is genuinely really urgent. But those are pretty far and few between. I mean, even in cases where we've faced big military decisions, like, for example, the invasion of Iraq some years ago, there were many months in the lead up to that decision. And in fact, there was a great deal of debate within the country about that. So, when there really are urgent decisions, leave it to the MPs. But generally, those are quite few and far between. MPs are incredibly busy people, and they spend an enormous amount of their time dealing with individual constituents' problems in a whole range of areas. Immigration problems, various legal problems, various issues they may have with government departments, for example. But I think we need to ask ourselves, what is an MP for? Is an MP there to really, almost like a social worker, sort out the problems of their individual constituents? Or is an MP a person who is there to represent our views and come together with other MPs representing different constituencies' views and find the best way of making law and policy? For me, that's what I think democracy is about. So I think, if we're going to go down this route, then we need to find a way in which we can resource MPs' offices to deal with individual constituents' problems and issues. But I think the MP themselves should really be the person conducting a constituency-wide conversation about the big issues facing their country and then taking those views into Parliament, arguing for them and finding the necessary compromises with MPs representing different constituencies to make good law. MPs are very attached to this idea that they are representatives rather than delegates for their constituencies. That their job is to be elected once every 5 years and then to use their judgment on the big issues of the day. They're very attached to that model. I think there's two things I would say about that, and I'd say to MPs. Firstly, that understanding of an MP's role was first developed by a writer and a politician himself called Edmund Burke back in the early 19th century, at a time when people weren't, many people weren't literate, many people didn't even have the vote. We live in a very different world now. We live in a world where people are far better educated, everyone has the vote, people want to have a say, they want to hold their MPs to account. The world has changed a lot in the last 200 plus years, and MPs need to update their mindset. The other thing I would say is that actually MPs don't use their judgment, their personal judgment, when they're voting on the big issues before the House of Commons. They're influenced largely by their party leader, they're influenced by the party whips, who often tell them how to vote on big issues, they're influenced by the media, and they're influenced by party donors, who have a big say over what goes on in political parties. So this notion that somehow the MP is using their common sense and their judgment is just, that's just nonsensical. The views of MyMP, the MyMP campaign, and my views as well, are that if anyone should be setting the agenda for how MPs vote, it's voters, not the party leaders, not party donors, not the media. The democratic principle is that it's the voters and the citizens who set that agenda. And I think that would be I'd like to see MPs who hold that sceptical view about the campaign answer that question.
And what if the MP fundamentally disagrees with the voters' decision?
My view is tough. My view is that an MP is elected and should be elected to represent the views of the voters. I think MPs have to get over their own egos. They sometimes might have to get over their own ideological views and listen to the voters. I think that's what voters are crying out for. So I think if an MP does a big consultation, big deliberation in their constituency on a particular issue like, privatisation of the NHS, and they're really in favour of privatisation, and the voters say, actually, we don't want privatisation in the NHS, the MP has to accept that. That is the word of the voters. That's what democracy is about.